All right, everybody. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today. My name is Tracy Campbell, a Chair Support Advisor here at TEC Canada. And I'm super excited to welcome you to this week's TEC Canada Deeper Insights webinar. I hope you're ready for a jam-packed session here today. We're going to be exploring the risks and opportunities of ESGs, dispelling myths, and uncovering its real value. Today, we are honored to have Sarah Keys with us. Sarah is the CEO of ESG Global Advisors Inc. and a TEC Canada member. Sarah is one of Canada's leading climate change experts with over a decade of experience as a thought leader, consultant, facilitator, and auditor. They regularly present to executive teams and boards of directors on the link between ESG and climate change with financial and operational performance and long-term value. Sarah helps clients establish ESG and climate change strategies that align with strategic priorities, enabling effective integration and existing risk and strategy processes. Sarah facilitates a module of ESG and sustainable finance in the ISD's Director of Education program and is the National Academic Director for ISD's Board Oversight of Climate Change program. They hold a Bachelor of Commerce from McGill University, ISO 14064-3 certification for greenhouse gas verifications, and received the 2018 Emerging Leader Award from CPA Ontario. Most recently, Sarah has received a Top 50 Changemaker Award from the Globe and Mail's Report on Business. Remember, all TEC Canada's Deeper Insights webinars are interactive. Whether you're joining us on Zoom or social media live streams, drop your questions and comments in the chat function for Sarah to engage and provide tailored insights to you throughout the webinar. Without further ado, let's dive into the world of ESG with Sarah Keys. Welcome, Sarah.
Thank you, Tracy, and a huge thanks to TEC Canada for having me here today. A proud member of TEC, and it's wonderful to be speaking on a topic, of course, of passion and high relevance. I'm sure many of you folks have started to come across this ESG acronym and trying to make sense of what it really means for you. So I'm going to share my screen. As Tracy mentioned, it's going to be an interactive webinar. So if and as you have questions, I'll check to see as Tracy pops up on the screen for me, pause and happily answer those as we go along. So please don't hesitate to input your questions throughout the session and we'll seek to answer them. We'll also leave some time at the end for an open Q&A. So I'm going to start by walking you through some of the overall myths and realities. As I mentioned, ESG has become a very mainstream topic in the business community in Canada, but also globally. And as a result of it becoming mainstream, there's a lot of confusion about what it is and is not. So today I'm going to seek to dispel some of those myths and illuminate some of the realities and the implications for small and medium-sized businesses, recognizing that so many of us as TEC members are often running privately held companies with 50 or less employees. So let's get started with some definitions. Let's dissect this acronym of environmental, social, and governance, or ESG. What it really is the environmental and social risks, opportunities, and governance practices that have not typically been valued in financial terms, meaning these are not risks and opportunities we've historically measured on our financial statements, but they do have the real potential in today's interconnected and complex and volatile world to materially impact the financial performance of a company or its ability to generate long-term business value for its shareholders, owners, and broader stakeholders. So again, this is squarely rooted in the things that we care about as TEC members, the growth of our company and its ability to sustain that value generation over the long term. And ESG, while a newer acronym, is not a new concept. So I would make the argument that this is an evolution as opposed to a revolution. And that's because we're all likely familiar with this notion of corporate social responsibility, or CSR. And that's what's depicted on the left-hand side of the screen here. CSR became a dominant conversation in the 1980s and quite mainstream in the business community in the 90s and early 2000s. Today, it's quite difficult to find a large company and even smaller and medium-sized companies that don't have some sort of expression of their corporate values in the context of corporate social responsibility. It's really all about the impact that the company is having on its stakeholders, and therefore it's driven by those affected stakeholders. And they include individuals within the company, like its employees, but also outside of the organization, like its customers, clients, and local communities. So this whole notion of CSR is certainly not dead. It's still very much so alive and well today. But what's relatively new is this idea that when we think about CSR, we're thinking about the impact of the company on society and the environment. And so we're really looking at the inside out lens. So it's about being a good corporate citizen. What's relatively new is the recognition that more broadly, we're realizing that big systemic environmental and social issues on the environmental side, like climate change, and on the social side, things like diversity, equity, and inclusion, and human rights, could actually impact the company financially. And so ESG is the newer term that became much more popularized in the early 2000s and really hit the mainstream in the last 2 years since the COVID-19 pandemic. And this is about flipping the script, taking a view of how environmental and social issues could actually have financial impacts on the company. And as a result, the ones who care about ESG are the ones who have a stake in the financial performance of the company. So ESG has really been driven by the financial community and financial stakeholders. The typical target audience for ESG is those who provide resources to the companies through the capital markets. So if you're a publicly traded company, this could certainly include your investors and shareholders. But even as a privately held company, this is also including lenders like banks, those who provide insurance, proxy advisors, credit rating agencies, and even prudential regulators. So what we're recognizing now is this concept of inside out and outside in actually need to be taken together. And that's where that umbrella term of sustainability comes into play. Sustainability is an umbrella term that really focuses on the ability of a business to meet their own needs today, as well as maintaining an ecological balance in the future for our society and environment to be able to thrive. So you can think about these as two overlapping but distinct terms. And in particular, the way I like to think about it is CSR is focused on values, whereas ESG is focused on value. So typically what we see are ESG factors being a subset of that broad realm of CSR issues that could actually materially impact the operational, financial performance of the company or its brand and overall reputation, resulting in implications for value. And when we think about why haven't we typically been measuring these ESG issues if they're financially material, we can kind of see from this diagram that our financial statements, and as mentioned in the introduction, I'm a chartered accountant by background, and I quickly realized that what's being depicted on the face of our balance sheet, our income statement, and our cash flow statement really isn't telling us the full picture of how we're driving that company value. In other words, the financial statements are but the tip of the iceberg. What we've started to see, particularly in the 21st century, as we bumped up against issues of resource scarcity, extreme weather events as a result of climate change, which are increasing in frequency and intensity, as well as an increasing focus on environmental and social issues like health, safety, and wellness post the COVID-19 pandemic, we're starting to appreciate that there are a whole bunch of non-traditional or non-financial factors that actually can impact the financial performance and the long-term value of our companies. So ESG is really about prioritizing the critical few. It's not trying to be all things to all people, as is much the case in the CSR realm, where you're trying to communicate the needs of many, many stakeholders. Rather, this flips the script and says, for me as a CEO and owner of my business, what do I need to be thinking about in terms of attracting and retaining strong talent in the long term, risks inherent in my supply chain for which companies are increasingly being held accountable, and how do I need to think about issues like water and waste management, for example? So it's not about taking every single factor from your CSR strategy and putting it into your ESG strategy. It's about saying, of this universe of issues that matter to our stakeholders, if we don't prioritize these ones, we actually are doomed to fail. So this concept is really about saying we need to prioritize. We can't be all things to all people, but we do recognize there are a critical few things that need to be addressed for us to sustain long-term company value and strong financial performance in the short, medium, and long term. And so I want to bring back this concept of materiality just to drive home this key point. So when we talk about the impacts of the company on society and the environment, or that inside-out view that is typically captured in traditional CSR strategies, we can see that it's all about how the company is impacting these key stakeholders. On the other side, ESG brings in the outside-in perspective, how societal and environmental issues are actually impacting the company, which has more of a financial materiality lens. Increasingly, organizations need to think about both, meaning there's an inextricable link between how we treat society and the environment and our key stakeholders and how they ultimately view our company. For example, our perception of how we treat our employees also directly impacts our ability to attract, retain, and develop strong talent. Many of us in the tech realm run people-based businesses. We say our greatest assets go up and down the elevator every single day. So we can start to see how you really can't separate, the company's role in environment and society with the impacts of those issues and the perceptions of its performance on the ability of the company to attract and retain talent, for example. And so when we talk about this ESG acronym, the number one question I get asked is, why is the G in there? And that's because many of us know the importance of good governance. And this is not a new concept, particularly in Canada, where we are known for having strong corporate governance processes. Traditional governance concepts like board quality, independence and accountability, shareholder rights, and senior management accountability linked to executive compensation schemes are all core practices that we're well familiar with. What's net new in the ESG space is the integration of the oversight of material, environmental, and social risks with core oversight of strategy, risk management, financial and operational performance, and disclosure to shareholders and other stakeholders. So many of us are running private enterprises. What's really important here is that we're not thinking about ESG as completely separate from everything else that we're doing as an organization. Rather, we prioritize those critical few environmental and social risks for our organization. We actually integrate those into our existing processes for strategic planning, enterprise risk management, and ultimately reporting and disclosure. Now, really important here is that each organization is going to have a different subset of those critical few environmental and social topics that should be subject to our core governance processes. And there's really three key drivers for what results in your ESG issues being material to the company. Like any materiality assessment, it's definitely an application of art and science. So the three key factors that typically drive the most relevant or material environmental and social issues for your company are first driven by the sector in which you're operating. The sector obviously drives the core business activities, and ultimately we often hear things like, I'm not actually manufacturing or producing anything. I operate a professional services business, so emissions are not a big issue for me. So it's about really right-sizing to the sector you're operating in as a starting point to define that universe of potential issues that may be relevant. Then we need to think about factor number two, and that's ultimately the jurisdictions where we're operating. So many of the environmental and social risks created for companies today are driven by local laws, policies, and regulations. Meaning, we really need to think about what is the sentiment of policymakers and regulators in the different jurisdictions where we're operating, and what are their expectations of us as a company when it comes to environmental and social issues. And the third and final area that you can use to determine your material ESG topics is really the entity-specific circumstances. Here I would point out a topic on the rights of Indigenous people. often a very common issue that is financially material to resource-based companies, for example. But if you're operating an organization that is nowhere close to traditional lands of Indigenous people, this may not be relevant to you, even if you operate in a sector where this issue is top of mind. So really important to look at your core sector where you're operating as a starting point, the jurisdictions where you're operating to identify the relevant laws, policies, and regulations, and then a consideration of your entity-specific circumstances. And you're going to hear me use the word integration overall today, because ultimately, if these environmental and social issues have the potential to impact both our financial and operating performance, but ultimately the long-term value we're trying to create out of our companies, then they should be subject to the same business processes and scrutiny as any other material issue we would monitor, things like revenue, customer retention, profit, and so on. And so many of you may have also noticed the anti-ESG movement. So in 2020 and 2021, we saw an incredible amount of enthusiasm and excitement around ESG, particularly galvanized by the COVID-19 pandemic, which quickly illuminated for us that a human health issue, a social issue, can have significant economic ramifications when we look at the policies taken to address those issues, for example, the lockdowns. And so when we look at now the anti-ESG movement, this is something that has really been born out of the mainstreaming of this ESG acronym in the capital markets. Investors and companies alike jumped onto this bandwagon and made a lot of big public commitments in 2020 and 2021. And so what we've started to see is a politicization of ESG issues, largely led out of the United States. Of course, what happens in the US often trickles up to Canada. So it is relevant to take stock of this anti-ESG movement and understand both the valid critiques and criticisms, but also some of the misconceptions and confusion around some of the terminology that's being utilized. So let's take a look at this. I always like to point out on the right, you can see Elon Musk really popularized the conversation around ESG with his tweet saying he is increasingly convinced that ESG is the devil incarnate. And this is April 2022. We've also seen a tremendous amount of pushback against BlackRock. The world's largest asset manager pretty much owns stocks in every S&P 500 company. And ultimately, they have been pushing companies to provide better disclosure on ESG because they think it's going to impact their risk-adjusted returns when they invest in companies. So some of the valid critiques and criticism, there is a real lack of comparability across all of the voluntary standards, frameworks, and reporting platforms that have emerged before regulators hopped on board to try and provide some consistency. And there's also been a lack of transparency in the methodologies of ESG research and ratings agencies, a comment I regularly hear from management teams and boards of my corporate clients who get assigned mismatched ratings depending on the organization that's assessing them. These are organizations like MSCI and Sustainalytics and ISS ESG, who independently rate companies and then sell those ratings reports to investors to use in their decision-making. And last but certainly not least, the phrase greenwashing has become a very popularized term, where we see companies making unfounded claims about their environmental or social performance, or setting massive targets without any plans to get there. The idea being, without any rules and regulation around the disclosure of this information, it's being used more as a marketing and PR tool as opposed to a core business value driver. Now, these are founded, and I'm going to talk about how some of these issues are actually being addressed in the ongoing regulation we're seeing today, and what it ultimately means for you, often leading small and medium-sized organizations which are privately held. But I also want to dispel a few of the myths that we've seen come out of the US. The first is the politicization of this. So the evolution of climate denial, which was no stranger to the US and certainly a key platform of the Trump administration in the previous 8 years. But also we've seen that this does not materially impact asset flows. So a lot of US-based politicians are trying to get state pension funds to pull their money away from big asset managers like BlackRock because they think about ESG factors in their investment analysis. But when we saw the money pulled out of BlackRock, it was but a drop in the bucket for all of their new asset inflows. So they're not seeing major departures of their clients over this issue. And one thing here I really want to hone in on is that ESG ratings are not synonymous with ESG performance. There's a misconception in the market that ESG ratings are taken at face value by investors and they make decisions whether or not to lend money to companies or invest in the equity of those companies based on those scores. This is simply not true. They actually use it as one input to ESG, but they really are focused on their risk-adjusted returns. The reason they are doing this is not to save the planet or the society that we live in, but actually to recognize that ESG represents intangible risks and opportunities that could impact the risk-adjusted returns of their portfolio. The world, and this is no surprise today, is increasingly destabilized. There are so many factors at play: economic, environmental, social, technological, and geopolitical. And as a result, investors who have long-term time horizons, like big pensions, really need to apply an ESG lens to uncover the risks that they're taking on when they invest in a company and make sure they're receiving the appropriate return for taking on those risks. So I mentioned earlier, there is a bit of a confusion about what does it mean to do ESG as an investor? And we've probably all seen some of the eye-popping statistics that show that in Canada, 1 out of every $2 professionally managed is using some sort of responsible investment approach. And in the US, that's 1 out of every $3. But the confusion here is this idea that all of the investors that are using responsible investment are doing things like impact investing and screening. But they're actually not. What they're mostly doing is ESG integration, which is not screening out any particular sector or company. Rather, it's a recognition that we really need to think about ESG factors alongside our traditional financial factors to improve our risk and opportunity analysis and get better returns. So it is a myth and a misconception to think that investors who are providing either debt or equity are really screening out companies, staying away from brown firms and only focusing on green firms. Rather, they're investing in every sector and asset class in the economy, but trying to drive improved ESG performance over time so they can maintain those returns. Tracy, I see you've come on my screen. Do we have a question or two?
Yeah, we do, Sarah. And just to kind of go back to the greenwashing topic, we have a question from a John Clark. How serious is greenwashing in ESG reporting, and what part of ESG providers playing in this issue?
Yeah, it's such a good question. I would say it's a massive issue today. And that's where we're starting to see on the global scale, the standard setters clamp down and create consistent and uniform accounting standards, which we've never seen before. And we're also starting to see local regulators. So the securities administrators in Canada, like the OSC, as well as even prudential regulators, Bank of Canada, and the Office of Superintendent of Financial Institutions. It's a big deal, and it is a very valid criticism because it really is actually shaking the trust in those disclosures made voluntarily by companies. I think the other piece here, though, is those ESG ratings existed because there were no standards requiring companies to report. So like any good business person, these ESG ratings firms popped up and said, hey, there's a gap in information in the market. Investors want this information and companies aren't voluntarily providing it. Standard setters and regulators aren't doing much. We're going to create a rating system, and they've made an incredible business. In fact, Sustainalytics was sold for about 37 million euro to Morningstar only a few years ago, and that's actually a Canadian company. So while I think they've played an important part in the market, I think they are soon going to face that same level of regulation, and there have indeed been calls for that.
Wonderful, thank you. And another question we had from a Gabrielle Schubach. Super excited to be here today. And considering the anti-ESG movement, what is your response to S&P recently announcing they will no longer hand out scores to corporate borrowers on ESG criteria? Yeah,
so what's really interesting, I raised greenwashing, But Gabrielle's question is actually hitting on something that I would be remiss not to talk about, and that's green hushing. So it's interesting. It's like been driven so much by the investors. And for those who follow BlackRock and Larry Fink, who is their CEO, he's been very outspoken about ESG over the last few years. He has definitely taken a few steps back this year and even said he's not going to use the term ESG. And so I think what we saw from S&P ratings was quite similar, a reluctance to continue assigning quantitative scores, but they're not actually changing the consideration of ESG factors. They're actually just reducing their transparency. And that's actually, I think, kind of a negative outcome of this anti-ESG movement, meaning they're continuing to focus on it because they think it's going to impact creditworthiness of companies and their returns long term, but they're not going to talk about it because they're concerned about being politicized. So there's actually this whole green hushing movement where investors are pulling back talking about it, but their activities inside haven't changed because it's not really the woke capitalism that it's being presented as in the US. It's really just about making sure you're protecting long-term business value.
That's terrific. Thank you so much, Sarah. We'll come back in a little bit here.
Wonderful. Great questions. I'm not surprised at all because the caliber of TEC members is always so fantastic. So the last point I want to make here is, quite frankly, anything with a valuation first, like ESG integration, it's just not woke capitalism. It's actually the exact same thing as traditional capitalism. It's just recognizing that our traditional investing approach of relying only on financial factors isn't telling us the whole story. And that's why investors care so much about it. Now, as we start to move to the right of this spectrum shown on the screen is where values come into play. So think about that ESG CSR distinction that I made earlier with the overlapping circles. A valuation-first approach is ESG, focused on financial materiality. It's when you start to blend in values as you get into thematic investing, impact investing, and negative or positive screening. That's where the CSR domain comes in, and that's where you might sacrifice on returns. So even in the US, they're quite confused with this terminology. They think ESG means going all the way to the far right of the spectrum, which is negative screening, for example, screening out fossil fuel companies. The reality is, of all of the dollars being managed, most of them are using an ESG integration approach, meaning that if companies don't actually articulate how they're thinking about these material, environmental, and social issues, they may be subject to engagement by those investors who are going to try to drive that performance. So the idea is, if you don't invest in the company, you can't influence or affect change. You can't manage your risk. So an ESG integration approach says, I will buy the company and I will use my power of my ownership to engage and influence with my investee companies to improve their ESG performance. And investors do this through dialogue with management and boards, through the use of their proxy votes at annual general meetings for public companies, collaborating with other investors to send the same message and increase their influence, and advocate for strong policy with regulators and standard setters. And so as a result of investors recognizing that ESG factors can materially impact all asset classes. So again, for many of you, you're not going to be publicly traded companies, but you may be seeking debt. And you may also find yourself in the supply chain of a large publicly traded company. So as a result, we're starting to see all of these factors converge. And it's really quite fascinating when you think about it, because kind of no one is left untouched, even if you're not someone who has institutional investors, shareholders. So we've seen ESG make its way into credit ratings. And the question just asked by Gabrielle is a fantastic one. So we see all of the major credit rating agencies, S&P, Fitch, Moody's, and others, integrating consideration of ESG factors into their creditworthiness assessments of companies because they're concerned about their ability to repay loans in the long run if they're not actively identifying and assessing and mitigating these risks. In the capital markets, we're seeing a ton of focus on standardizing ESG disclosure and regulation. I'm actually going to talk in more detail about that in the coming slides, so I'll leave that for now. But ultimately, what we've seen is this whole voluntary space has really created a lot of confusion, a lot of noise, and it's really not quite helpful for the companies who are trying to satisfy information requests and deal with this additional reporting burden. It's also not that useful for investors who are getting patchworks of information and inconsistent disclosure from companies in the same sector, for example. Now, importantly, is the bottom three for small, medium enterprises that TEC members often represent. And the first one is this increasing focus on supply chains. So, mentioned at the outset, I have the pleasure of advising companies and investors on their approaches. And what I've observed in 2023 is an increasing focus on supply chain by large public companies because they're seeing the writing on the wall with these new regulations that are asking them to take accountability for their upstream and downstream supply chain impacts. What I mean here is they're actually, for example, the new regulations that have been put forward by the SEC and in Canada, the Canadian Securities Administrators are saying that large public companies have to report on their emissions from their direct operations, but they also actually have to report on their emissions from their supply chain. As a result, I have seen so many small, medium-sized, privately held companies reaching out to us saying, how do we develop a strategy to respond to our customers who are these big public companies who have already started asking me for this information? So again, that supply chain focus is going to have a trickle-down effect to many private enterprises who will be asked to provide this information to their large public company customers so they in turn can fulfill their new reporting obligations. Now, reputation and social license to operate might be one of the most important pieces for small and medium-sized businesses to keep in mind. I'll talk a little bit about trends with respect to Gen Zs and millennials, but we know increasingly in an age of social media that intangibles are absolutely driving value. So I often say that ESG issues tend to be the CSR issues you did not proactively manage, meaning there's a controversy or a crisis that lands you in the front page of the Globe and Mail or trending on social media platforms. There's never before been such an instant way for stakeholders to communicate with one another, rally, and have negative impacts to brand, reputation, and social license to operate. And the last piece here I do want to highlight are these intangibles. So many of us are used to the core financial statements that drive our business. And as an accountant, I've really noticed that intangibles have really shifted from not being a huge contributor of value about 50 years ago. It used to be that almost 90% of the S&P 500, their value was derived from tangible assets, property, plant, and equipment, inventory, and so on. But fast forward to today, and now the inverse is true. In a mere 50 years, we see 90% of companies' value of the S&P 500 being driven by intangibles, things like goodwill, brand and reputation, consumer loyalty, etc. So we know overnight if an ESG controversy pops up, and I'll give you an example that's non-environmental. I'm sure folks remember United Airlines before the pandemic back in 2019 had a video captured of an overbooked flight where a doctor was forcibly removed and ended up with a bloody nose. They lost over $1 billion in market cap as a result of that video going viral. So we can see that the rules of the game have certainly changed. And I do want to point out that it's not just Canada. This is very much so a global trend. And while investors often do invest globally, it's a combination of public and private sector attention. So I often get asked the question, isn't this really the job of the government to set good policy? Business's job is to maximize profit. Well, I think increasingly we can't really extract business from the environment and society upon which it operates and depends. And the World Economic Forum issues a global risks report every single year. And in 2023, we see the top 10 risks, almost all of them being environmental. So we see 80% of them being environmental, connected to the issue of climate change, and other social risks like cost of living crises and large-scale involuntary migration being acute risks in the next 2 years. As a climate expert, I've heard 1 million times over that climate change is a faraway problem and something we don't have to worry about today. Knowing that TEC Canada has members across Canada, I think everyone can acknowledge that the data is clear that this wildfire season is exceptionally beyond anything we've ever experienced before. In fact, the data shows that to date, and we're only at the beginning of August, 4 times the total hectares have burned in wildfires in Canada this year relative to any year prior. And as we look out to the long-term time horizon, and hopefully all of our businesses are successful and thriving in that 10-year time frame, we can see that these risks escalate quite quickly, all connected to this issue of climate change. And that's really why we see such a heavy focus on climate change. I often hear it as the big E in ESG. But the reason is that if we don't address that issue, all of the other social and economic, geopolitical, and technological issues will become even more complex and interconnected. So it's the interconnection between these different categories of risks that is so impactful. The other thing I just want to highlight is one of the risk categories is economic. In the next 2 years, we don't have a single core risk that's economic that will impact global financial stability. 80% of them are environmental and social. Tracy, I see you've got another question from the audience.
Yeah, things are just starting to pop off in the comments section here. So I wanted to hop on and share some of these questions and requests for just some comments as well. So from Arta by Call, you touched on the environmental piece a bit here just now. And they're saying, thank you for the session, Sarah. And besides COVID, why do you think that the social issues are the least important topic in annual reports, especially with respect to human rights issues in the value chain, and what can be done from the government side to remedy this?
An excellent question. And actually, I think really highlights measurement, right? So it's really kind of fascinating because ESG all started in the investor community. Investors love to measure. I'm an accountant, so I totally get that. But it's easy enough if you think about it. The issue of climate change, we kind of have one universal metric we can compare right across the board, and that is greenhouse gas emissions. Social issues are not nearly as simplified as that, and as a result can be quite complex. They have a systemic element. So when we think about human rights, there's obviously the systemic component to that, and then there's the localized component as well. But I think that just because we haven't been able to historically measure it doesn't mean we shouldn't be managing it and focusing on it. I think, too, one of the things I'd like to see more organizations doing is articulating and understanding the connection between these environmental and social issues. I'll give a great example here. One of the biggest concerns that I actually have in relation to climate change is the risk of large-scale involuntary migration. We've definitely seen what refugee crises can do in terms of economic impacts and social impacts to everyday lives and human beings. When we look at climate change in the long run, you can see in the 10-year time horizon that large-scale involuntary migration is going to be a massive issue. And so we can really see that just because organizations haven't been able to measure it doesn't mean that it shouldn't be managed. I think some great examples of what government policy can and are doing are things like the Modern Slavery Act that we've just seen come into play, where companies are going to be held accountable for any sort of child labor or modern slavery as well in their supply chains. So it's starting, and it's definitely an inspirational time to be working in this space.
Thank you, Sarah, once again.
Thanks, Tracy. Okay, so I've mentioned briefly why climate change and this whole net zero topic is so important. And in particular, it's because of the huge gap that we have right in front of us. If you look on the left, this is analysis by McKinsey. Business as usual is going to put us nowhere close to what the best science says we need to do to avert the worst and most catastrophic impacts of climate change. Many organizations, companies and investors alike, as well as governments, declared net zero by 2050 goals in 2020 and 2021. But the gap between announcements and action is significant, and the time frame and the window to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees is closing rapidly. And that's why we see a lot of capital markets initiatives and collaborations, meaning individual investors can no longer really take the time to individually engage with companies, and they've started to pool their resources and work together on a variety of different alliances to drive action. The most interesting of which here is Climate Action 100+, which now has a Canadian copycat called Climate Engagement Canada. And that's really a selection of investors who are engaging with the top 100 emitters in the world and trying to push those companies to decarbonize. Realistically, I often hear the comment, why would investors invest in fossil fuel-based companies? Why don't they just pull their money? Well, the concern is if they pull their money, then those assets will be picked up by investors who don't care about this. So the idea is to invest in the company and then engage with them to drive them to set targets and establish transition plans to achieve net zero by 2050. And here I want to highlight that growing focus on social, which relates to our previous question. Really not a lot of baseline data out there, even in terms of company performance and employee expectations. So our firm did a study with another organization, Argyle Communications, to figure out which social issues are being prioritized because companies are not disclosing it publicly. And as you can see, the top ones are employee engagement and health and safety, perhaps not surprising. But I think the expansion beyond just employee health and safety being physical and into mental health is yet one example of the consequences of COVID-19 that broaden our perspective. I would also note that human rights and community relations and labor practices were fairly high up on the agenda. So I do think over time, we're going to see more organizations using reporting frameworks to help articulate not only the risks they're managing, but the positive impacts they can have on social issues. And as I mentioned earlier, the problem is that the S remains the most challenging ESG area to measure. I also find it really interesting because philosophically, there's also a really important conversation as to whether we should be trying to create metrics to measure things that relate to people. Some things just can't be quantified and monetized. So there's a qualitative component, but this is really what's driving it, is that investors are having a hard time asking companies for specific data points, often because they are so localized and specific to the company. So there's a real lack of standardization around social metrics, but I do think that some of the developments on the global scale are really working toward this. I mentioned earlier, I'll talk about Gen Z and millennials. So I'm a millennial myself. I often make the joke that the intergenerational wealth transfer that is set to happen between boomers to their millennial children is the largest one in human history. So $30 trillion expected to go to over 75 million millennials over the next few decades. Why is this important? Well, 88% of high net worth millennials, those who are maybe tech CEOs or have received significant inheritances from their boomer parents, they're actively reviewing the ESG impact of their investment holdings. And interestingly, when they look at what they expect their financial advisors to do, almost 90% of them expect the advisor to evaluate the company's ESG factors and performance before they even suggest that a millennial invests in it. And millennials are twice as likely than their boomer counterparts to actually say they don't want to invest in a company because of the negative impacts of the product or service on people's livelihoods or the environment. And why do we care about this? Well, from a small, medium-sized business standpoint, there are significant implications for talent attraction, retention, and engagement and productivity. What I think is so interesting about Deloitte's Global Millennial Survey is that it now incorporates the Gen Z perspective, which, as you can see, is even more stark in terms of caring about environmental and social issues relative to the millennial generation. So if you thought the millennial generation was bad, the Gen Zs have even more expectations on companies. But their expectations are not always met. So when they asked them about this, Gen Zs said less than half of them believe that business is having a positive impact on society. But this is actually the first year that the percentage hasn't dropped. So they're maybe starting to feel some enthusiasm about the role of business. But 6 in 10 Gen Zs and millennials believe businesses have no ambition beyond wanting to make money. And of course, this really does impact where they want to work because they often want to work with organizations that align with their values. What's also interesting is so we see them caring about how they invest, we see them caring about where they work, and we see them caring about their lifestyle choices. Now, I mentioned earlier, I'm a millennial. I would say a lot of these things here shown on the screen are things that I'm actively doing to do my part to live in alignment with my values, most notably eating a vegetarian diet for the last 12 years. So climate change has become a source of anxiety and is a major stressor for Gen Zs and millennials. 6 in 10 are saying they felt anxious about the environment in the past month. I'm guessing the 2024 Deloitte Millennial Survey will show a lot more because the extreme weather events and wildfires have really spiked this year. So they're making different lifestyle choices, from not driving a car to avoiding buying fast fashion, focusing on making homes more energy efficient, going vegetarian or vegan, and interestingly, having fewer or no children. So again, it really does impact, depending on your business, you may want to take note of some of these trends in terms of the overall demand from consumers in the long run, as Gen Zs and millennials become the dominant generations with purchasing power. So I mentioned earlier that there are new reporting frameworks, but before I jump into that and some of these solutions, Tracy, are there any additional questions you wanted to ask at this point?
No, Sarah, we are pretty much caught up. You're doing a very excellent job at answering the questions. It's almost like you're reading them yourself. So thank you.
Excellent, Tracy. So I painted a picture of an extremely confusing landscape with a bunch of different ESG ratings and a lot of different voluntary reporting frameworks, and a bit of a dog's breakfast for companies and investors to try and sift through and make sense of what it is they're supposed to be measuring and how they should be reporting it. Thankfully, in 2021, we saw a very important development globally. And that is that there is going to be harmonization of all of these voluntary frameworks in order to provide consistent and comparable reporting to investors and other providers of capital, like lenders, insurers, regulators, credit rating agencies, and so on. So the two standards, if you have not started doing this work, as a small medium enterprise, the best news I can tell you is that you get to leapfrog all of the confusion that some of the larger players have had to deal with. Many of them have up to 5-6 different reporting frameworks that they use, whereas right now we can see it coalescing around these two key frameworks, the SASB standards and the TCFD recommendations. So I'm going to speak briefly about both of them. So the SASB standards, SASB stands for Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. What's really interesting about this is that they take a sector by sector approach. So what they've done is create 77 different industry specific standards that give you a baseline of the material ESG topics for a company operating in that sector, and then the recommended accounting metrics that you should be measuring and reporting to your stakeholders. Now, SASB was actually born out of the United States back in 2010 and has had significant uptake in the last 2 years, again, because companies are trying to fulfill a lot of growing requests from investors for this information. The good news for Canadian companies is it aligns really nicely to our industry sectors. So if you're starting to try and figure out what are those subset of CSR issues that might be material to me, a really good place to start to figure out what are those sector-specific issues is to look at the relevant SASB standards for your organization. And we're seeing growth across the board in SASB standard usage across different jurisdictions as well. And that's because the SASB standards are now part of the IFRS Foundation, the International Financial Reporting Standards that are set in for number of countries, over 100 countries around the world, and Canada uses IFRS for its public company financial accounting. So the fact that it's been endorsed by the global accountants is really why you're starting to see significant uptake of the SASB standards. The other framework is the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. So whereas SASB looks at all different E, S, and G issues, TCFD is really focused in on the issue of climate change. And recall that the reason for this is because it poses systemic financial risks to the capital markets and to the functioning of our global economy. And that's why we see the support for the TCFD skyrocket, particularly driven by the financials, who are concerned that they have unpriced climate risk in their lending portfolios, in their equities, and so on. And they're really driving companies to provide this information. Interestingly, the TCFD was actually created at the request of the G20 and led by the Financial Stability Board. They published their final recommendations in 2017. And ultimately, over the last 2 years, the growth in supporters of TCFD is part of why it too is now going to be absorbed into the IFRS Foundation. And this is why we see the increase in market support. Corporate adoption of the TCFD recommendations and the SASB standards is really in response to investors asking for this information. And you can see just how quickly this has started to change. Importantly, I want you to know that the two things fit together. SASB provides industry-specific standards with accounting metrics, whereas the TCFD is a broad disclosure framework that is cross-industry and not industry-specific. So really, the TCFD's framework focuses on these four categories. How does the organization actually govern and oversee material climate risk and opportunity? How does it embed it into its strategic planning and resilience planning in the long run? How are climate risks embedded into enterprise risk management? And ultimately, what are the metrics and targets that the organization is using to monitor and assess its performance? And so SASB can be used for those metrics and targets. And those quantitative metrics shed light on some of the qualitative disclosures recommended by the TCFD, particularly around the effectiveness of the company's governance strategy and risk management processes. And so both of these have now been embedded into the global accounting standard setting world. There were calls for this for many years, and the International Sustainability Standards Board was established in late 2021 and has just released its final first two standards. We have IFRS S1, which is focused on the disclosure of broad sustainability risks and opportunities, and that's aligned with SASB. And we have IFRS S2, which is focusing specifically on the issue of climate risk and opportunity, and that's aligned with the TCFD. Again, they're very focused on that single level of materiality, financial materiality. And the intention here is to communicate by companies to their providers of capital or their investors how they are assessing and managing their broad sustainability risks and opportunities, and more specifically, the issue of climate change. This is particularly important because these standards also include that extension. IFRS S2 includes the extension for companies to report on the emissions associated with their supply chain. So I mentioned earlier that those who may be private companies with large public company customers, ultimately, they may be asked for this information, not because you're required to do IFRS S2, but because your largest customers are preparing for their requirements and they need this information from you as a supplier. We've also seen all of the regulators come to the table and say they're going to be endorsing and supporting the adoption of the global standards. And that's perhaps surprising to folks, but even out of the US, the Securities Exchange Commission has tabled a new regulation for all public companies to be required to disclose climate change information. Similarly, here in Canada, we've seen the Canadian Securities Administrators issue a similar rule. And we've also seen the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions in Canada, which regulates our largest pensions and insurers and the banks, say that they would like to see alignment with the global standards. So you can see all of this convergence is finally happening. So the last piece I wanted to touch on here are really the implications for small and medium-sized businesses. A few key takeaways for you, and then a couple of resources. So the first is, even if you're an organization that doesn't have a lot of emissions, you're not going to be able to ignore ESG, particularly because it extends well beyond public companies for some of the reasons I've talked about, whether it's attracting and retaining good talent, accessing information for your own public company customers who need this information, or broader social issues that really could drive the performance of your company, even if you assess climate change as not material. So it goes well beyond climate change. And I want to leave you with that key takeaway. The second is really looking at who your big customers are. If they haven't asked you yet, they will be asking you for this information because they are starting to prepare for their own reporting obligations. I've seen this across the board, private companies that work in healthcare research, for example, but their customers are big pharmaceutical companies. They're being asked for their emissions, even though all they do is clinical research and clinical trials. So this is starting to extend its tentacles into much smaller companies that have large publicly traded customers. We also know that if you're relying on humans and human capital to drive value in your company, let's say you're a service business like I am, you're going to face new challenges and opportunities in attracting and retaining Gen Z and millennials, as evidenced in the Deloitte Millennial Survey. And anyone who's seeking debt, you're going to be assessed on your ESG performance by lenders and credit rating agencies. So disclosure is really important. They often will just look at what's publicly available. They won't even ask you for the information. So you may want to proactively disclose on your website, for example. And anyone operating globally, you should definitely pay close attention because there is a patchwork of new ESG reporting rules and regulations. And while they're all seeking to converge with that global standard, a lot of work still remains to be done. And I wanted to leave you with something practical. CPA Canada does have free resources for small, medium enterprises to use in developing an approach to ESG. Here you can see a 5-step process that also includes a case study. So the idea being there's some guidance available as well as a case study to illustrate the process in action. So I really do encourage you to take a look at that. And I thought I would pull out one of the case studies as a good example on the topic of emissions management. Veriform is a real company based in Ontario, family-owned small medium enterprise, and they actually saw a really clear business case to reduce their GHG emissions. And it's actually not nearly as daunting as it appeared. It also ended up having some pretty clear payback periods in terms of cost savings because a lot of the low-hanging fruit for this organization, which was really about energy efficiency. And so you can actually read through this case study and see some examples of how a small medium enterprise really started in the kind of 2010s to set deliberate goals and actions to reduce its emissions and has since been profiled by the federal government as a great example of a small family-owned company that's made the business case for reducing emissions while thriving and creating value, both for the company and for its stakeholders. And my last takeaway for you is just 3 steps to get started. And the first one really does come down to prioritization. Recognize that as a small, medium enterprise, you can't be all things to all people and you have limited resources. Conducting an ESG materiality assessment allows you to prioritize those resources toward the ESG risks and opportunities that could actually impact your company's value and performance. The second area is making sure that if you have a board of directors and certainly with your leadership team, you should really ensure that folks understand their role and responsibility for overseeing ESG issues. And this is often a qualitative approach. So really, I think the benefit here is you don't need to have a ton of data to have these initial conversations. But when you do get into data measurement and reporting, I'd say start with greenhouse gas emissions, especially if you have big public company customers, but start to make a plan over time to crawl, then walk, then run, gathering other relevant data points in the future based on your most important topics identified in your assessment. So I think I've come up close to my time. I really want to extend a huge thank you to all of you for your fantastic questions. They were wonderful. And a thanks to Tracy and TEC Canada for having me here today.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for being here. This was a tremendous webinar with, as we said, jam-packed full of insights for our community here today. We did just have one last question that ties back to an earlier slide that I wanted to highlight here. Knowing that, like I believe it was slide 2, knowing that the most referred or used framework is SDGs, how do you help leaders understand the SASB plus TCFD and SDGs?
Yeah, so the Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs, are often being used by companies for that impact materiality, right? So the SDGs having been set by governments for sustainable development, really it's about companies trying to articulate how they're positively contributing toward the Sustainable Development Goals. So the nice thing is with this double materiality approach, SASB and TCFD really look at that outside in, the impacts on the company, and the SDGs are often used as a framework to look at the inside out impacts toward progress on sustainable development.
Wonderful. Thank you again so much, Sarah. It's been a true delight being able to host this webinar with you here today. For everyone watching, please know that our Deeper Insights webinars are recorded and will be available on our website as well as through our social media channel. And yes, Sarah's slides will be available from today as well. Thank you again, Sarah, and thank you everyone for your attendance here today. Looking forward to the next one, and we'll see you again soon.
Thanks, Tracy. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.